All right, today's subject is going to be over the Mishkan, or as we know it in English, the Tabernacle. And of course, the Tabernacle is a huge staple of the Old Testament and some of the functions of ancient Israel. And you and I might be more familiar with the temple, because after all, when you get into the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, even Acts, we find Paul. We find all these individuals that are at the temple. And what's the difference between the temple and the tabernacle? Probably an oversummation of it, but the temple was actually in Jerusalem, and it's a fixed structure that was at a fixed place. Whereas the tabernacle, it was something that traveled from location to location with ancient Israel. Anytime that the cloud would up and go and that gave Israel their cue to move, they would pack up the tent, literally, because that's partially what the tabernacle was and all the vestments inside of it, and they would go from location to location. But this tabernacle, it was where the priests would do their avode, where they would do their priestly duty from the people to God and from God to the people, and they would do a lot of the sacrifices. They would do a lot of their rituals and a lot of the things that would take place there. And so whenever you see tabernacle and temple, yeah, you could probably say they're cousins. They're not the same exact thing, but there's a lot of the blood that's the same. Pun, I guess, semi-intentional there. But I want us to go ahead and talk about the tabernacle just a little bit. And of course, the tabernacle, we have items such as the table of showbread. We also have the menorah. And we can't forget, of course, the Ark of the Covenant that was there. And when you get to the second half of Exodus, to me, in my opinion and my experience, you're really starting to dig your boots in deep, because at that point you go from a shift in style of the Bible talking about characters, their life, their stories, their struggles, and you have this narrative to where it kind of flows into the next chapter, to the next generation, to the next group of peoples. When you get to that second half of the book of Exodus, you are getting into painstaking detail of all of the elements of the tabernacle and all the different items and metals and different spices. You're talking about yarns that have so many threads, like 6 threads twisted together and interjoined with another one, and so many handbreadths thick, to where a lot of people, whenever they're doing like the Bible in a Year challenge, when they get to this portion of scripture, a lot of folks just lose steam. And I'm not saying that as an accusatory thing or saying it's a bad thing. That's a reality, and that's a reality I 100% understand and I get. You know, for some people, they really don't know the function of the tabernacle because they're more used to the New Testament. And God bless them, I'm happy that they're used to the New Testament itself. And I know people, oftentimes, especially on Old Testament subjects, they're very dismissive towards anything in the Old Testament because, in their mind, there's no relevance of needing to know this information. Just for a quick example, years ago, I guess it was probably about 7, 8 years ago, I got a message from a friend of mine, and they were saying that they went ahead and they purchased this house and home, and they were thankful for God for aligning everything the way it did for them to get this really beautiful house. And they said they wanted to honor God in that purchase perpetually. And one of the things they wanted to do to honor God was they had requested me and my wife to come in, and they wanted to host a Bible study, but they were asking me to lead it. And they were going to invite some friends, and we were going to have some food, and we were going to have, some snacks and things. And of course, me being me, wholeheartedly, instantly said yes. I don't even know if they finished the question before I said yes. And we go to the study, and it's, the couple who own the home. It's my wife and I, and through different events and iterations of it, there were different people that came in. And one of the groups of people that came in, one of the couples, was this couple's pastor and his wife. And we were studying the book of Jonah. And the book of Jonah, it's an acre in the ocean. It's only 48 verses in total. And so we had an hour and a half's worth of time, roughly, approximately, if even that long, to study the book. And I went through, we were talking, we were going back and forth. I was bringing out and highlighting a lot of the things I found in the book, parallels to Christ. Nothing will be given this generation but the sign of Jonah. And I thought it went really, really well. I was happy with it. And as I concluded, I got up and I went over to their kitchen area and got myself a drink. Well, while I was gone, they were talking at the table, everybody that was left. A couple of us were there in the kitchen. And the pastor's wife looked over and said, "I do not understand why we had to study that." And her friend said, "Well, what do you mean?" She goes, "Well, isn't reading the Bible just enough? Why do we have to study it?" And mind you, this is their pastor's wife who thought the only thing that we needed to do, we didn't have to study at a Bible study. We should have just read it and called it good. And so through the years, that is just a single instance of things that I have ran to quite a bit, because to their credit, it's a different time, it's a different era. In a lot of ways, it's a different people. And sometimes we treat these things so foreign and so alien, we don't recognize it's the same God who helped ordain much of that system in the Old Testament. And, whenever we go to the refrigerator and we start pulling out different Tupperware pieces or different pieces of food, we're going to take them out and we're going to examine them for what it is they are. If there's something good that we can use after making sure it's still healthy, still viable for us to eat, we will take it in and we will get nourishment from that. There are some things that we might have to reject because they might spoil or they might expire. And I feel like just because some people lose interest in a particular subject, they're missing out on spiritual calories. They're missing out on good spiritual meals because they don't understand how to use something. They may not understand how to digest it, or they may not understand how to prepare it in a way that is spiritually palpable to them. And so I want us to take a look, like I said, at this tabernacle. And it's just going to be a short thing. I know I haven't been up to par recently on keeping up with the Torah portion teachings. That is something I do apologize for. The past several weeks, we've had family members in and out of the house staying with us. And our house, it's a decent-sized house, but it's a 3-bedroom house. And my kids have their own respective rooms. My wife and I have our own room. And anytime we have guests over, the living room's occupied. So whether I'm on day shift or night shift, I don't have the room and time availability because we've always got somebody here. And like I said, that's not something I'm necessarily griping about. I just hope you give me a little bit of grace. And so to compensate for that, I just want to speak about the tabernacle, and a detail about it I find fascinating on an in general basis. When you start taking a look, like I said, at the details of the tabernacle and some of the different things that are hidden within it, some of the things that are known to perhaps more of the priests, the Kohens and the Kohanim, one of the things it talks about is that it has to be made of a certain material, like the tent itself. And what I find intriguing is it's supposed to be made of what is known as tachash skin. And what is tachash skin? Well, in Hebrew, it's just tachash skin. But whenever you translate it into English, we find ourselves having a little bit of a problem. Why is that? Well, it's because we try to translate it into something, we try to have an answer for something we don't know if we really have an answer to. And here's what I mean by that. When you go through different translations of the Bible in English, a tachash skin will be translated into something like a badger skin, which, could be entirely probable. Keep in mind where Israel is at, though. They're in the desert. And by definition of what a desert is, it's anywhere that has less than 1 inch of rainfall per year, which is a simple summation of it. So badger, that would make sense. They're kind of hardy as far as that's concerned. They're found in the wilderness. But here's where we find a little bit more complications. In English, we translate it sometimes as badger skins. Other times it's translated as porpoise skins. Sometimes it's translated as dolphin skins. And sometimes even crazier than that, some of the more ancient English translations, I say ancient, some of the very much older English translations actually say the tabernacle was made out of unicorn skins. Now, I'm not going to tell you which one I necessarily feel is a little bit more ludicrous than the rest, but here's the thing. Go back to what I said. They were in the desert. How often do you find dolphins in the desert? In my experience, not a whole awful lot, if ever. Same thing with the porpoise. And while a unicorn is technically the national animal of Scotland, I have my issues with that as well. But it's like when it comes to words in Hebrew versus words in English, talking about a body of water. We might talk about it's a pond, or it could be a lake, a sea, it could be the ocean. All of them, depending on what word we use, you can have this mental imagery built about the size of whatever this body of water is. Because we know if it's a pond, it's not going to be this huge, massive thing. If it's a lake, you could wind up taking a boat in it and be on the other side not too long from now. If it's a sea, that could be a problem, and you're probably not going to go ahead in your bass boat and cross the ocean. So we have these words that help identify something relative to size, relative to scale, whereas in Hebrew, it's all one word. So you may not know if it's a pond, or you may not even know if it's an ocean. And tachash skins, what are tachash skins? Again, it's something we don't really know. But to provide a little bit of context of what tachash skins are, it's used when talking about the tabernacle, and nowhere else in the rest of the entire Old Testament do we read anything about tachash skins, except for the book of Ezekiel. When you start reading about these tachash skins in the book of Ezekiel, you actually find out it's shoes. It's sandals, in a way. It's a shoe material. And so I want us to stop for just a moment and think about the similarities. If we are able to connect these and find a similarity between the tabernacle and shoes, what do we find? And keep in mind, if we wear shoes, what are we going to do? We're going to be walking, and they're going to be protection to our feet. It's going to keep us up off the ground. But whenever we're mobile and we move, that shoe is going to be moving. Well, when it comes to the tabernacle, if we take that information of it, shoes, tachash skins being a material for a shoe, what do we find happening with the tabernacle? We find it traveling. And of course, the tabernacle, it housed the things like the Ark of the Covenant. That tabernacle represented the space of God's holiness, of Him dwelling amongst His people, Him dwelling with His people. And so just as you would wear shoes and you would begin to travel and leave footprints, it's almost like it's saying that this tabernacle was God's shoe, where He would leave His footprints as He traveled with His people. One thing I'll admit to is I just started reading this week. I finished up the back half of the book of Exodus as I've been keeping up with the Torah portions. And I decided I want to go ahead and jump into the New Testament. And I read John chapter 1. And of course it talks about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh, and it dwelt among us. And I find it so interesting that whatever tachash skins were, whether they're badger skins, whether they're anything, whatever else, we find God's presence found inside skin. And then of course when it comes to Jesus, we find that that Word became flesh and it dwelt among us, and it walked among us. And so it's kind of neat that we find these little clues, these little hints, these winks, these nods. And so, like I said, I know this was not a super deep dive into the tabernacle itself, but it's the one major thing that tickles me about the subject of the tabernacle itself. And so hopefully I've given you a little bit of something to think on. Thank you for your time. Be blessed.